Revelation chapter 17. I will read all 18 verses, and then we will move into a discussion about what on earth is going on in this chapter. Verse 1, Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, Come, I will show you the judgment of the great whore who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and with the wine of whose fornication the inhabitants of the earth have become drunk. So he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her fornication. And on her forehead was written a name, a mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of whores and of earth's abominations. And I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. When I saw her, I was greatly amazed. But the angel said to me, Why are you so amazed? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. The beast that you saw was and is not and is about to ascend from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And the inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will be amazed when they see the beast, because it was and is not and is to come. This calls for a mind that has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. Also they are 7 kings, of whom 5 have fallen. One is living and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must remain for only a little while. As for the beast that was and is not, it is an 8th, but it belongs to the 7, and it goes to destruction. And the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour together with the beast. These are united in yielding their power and authority to the beast. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And those with him are called and chosen and faithful. And he said to me, The waters that you saw, where the whore is seated, are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. And the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the whore. They will make her desolate and naked. They will devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. For God has put it into the hearts to carry out his purpose by agreeing to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God will be fulfilled. The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. The written word of the Lord for us tonight. Yeah, we can say thanks be to God to that. Okay, so what's going on?
It's talking about what's going on in history with Rome.
Sounds like there's a little bit of talk of Rome. Yeah, and there is, and we will discuss that tonight. Yeah, we will touch on that. Rome is definitely present.
It seems to be a timelessness that he was, he is.
Oh, yeah. Was and is not and is to come, the language for the beast. We'll discuss that at length in a bit, but what does that sound like? That's describing whom? You remember who is that describing? In this chapter, the one who was and is not and is to come from the bottomless pit is whom? The beast. What does that sound like? You said it. Sounds like the Lamb. What is the Lamb? The Lamb who was and is to come. So this is, once again, an anti-being. We'll discuss that language a little bit further. But yeah, that's really interesting. A timelessness to that. What else? What else jumps out?
Somebody's finally getting their just desserts.
Yeah, there's some justice, some judgment going on here. Yeah. Who is it? Babylon. Babylon. I perhaps should have given you a little bit of a warning that chapter 17 is not very PG. There's some heavy language in here. This is some adulterated language that we're talking about in Revelation chapter 17. What's that? It's a little heavy. Today's a heavy day, it seems. But it won't be so heavy once we get into it. Once we dig into it, it'll be, we'll see a little bit more of what's going on. Anything else that jumps out? Well, one thing, let's jump right into this then. And before going verse by verse, which we do almost every week, one thing to note is we're talking about Babylon, and Babylon is described as what? Evil. And Babylon is personified. She's called a woman. Babylon is a woman, and in Revelation, she's a whore. But one thing we note about this woman is that she is a counterpart to the woman we read of in chapter 12. Think back to chapter 12. Do you remember of another woman that we read about? And what happened to that woman? Who was she, and what did she do? The woman in chapter 12 was faithful. You remember the woman from chapter 12 was the mother of the people of God, and was even called the mother of the Messiah. So we've got these two women in this book, and we'll see the differences here at greater length. But we see these counterparts, these different women. One woman who was incredibly faithful and who is the mother of the people of God. Here we've got Babylon, who is unfaithful and is not the mother of the people of God, but is called the mother of all unfaithful, the mother of all adulterers. And so we've got these counter women. But when we're looking at chapter 17, we've got to talk a little bit about genre again. We spent time this morning talking about the genre of poetry. Tonight we need to look again about genre. And we've discussed it before, but I just want to bring it up a little bit. Do you remember the type of literature that we compared Revelation to? A comic. And tonight we really see that. We discussed how it's similar to a comic. It's over the top. It's grandiose. It's almost like a caricature. It paints a picture in vivid language. John writes these words in ways that make us picture things. We see things. We imagine things. In comics, they invoke your imagination. But something else that we see about it is that this chapter is also a bit of satire. We're all familiar with satire. We've all read and watched satirical things. But I think what we're most familiar with when it comes to satire is humorous satire. It's comical and it's funny, but it proves a point. And so I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the Babylon Bee. It's a website, babylonbee.com, and it's really funny because it's a Christian satire website. And they come up with these silly articles that are all fake. And they all have funny titles that catch your attention, and then you read the article and it's funny. One of them, I have two that I want to just reference. I'm not going to read the whole article, but just to look at. One of them was the title of this article, Church Forced to Admit Hoarding Problem After Misplacing Youth Pastor. And then the other one that I think is really funny, after 12 years of quarterly church attendance, parents shocked by daughter's lack of faith. It's funny, but it's sad. So it proves a bit of a point. You read the article and they tell the story of this fake family that were very faithful to bring their kids to church 4 times a year whenever they didn't have sports events or whenever they didn't have this or that on their schedule. Whenever it was convenient, they were always in church, and they're all of a sudden shocked that after their child has grown up, she no longer has the faith of her parents. And it's satire, and it's humorous, and it's funny, but it proves a point. And it forces the reader to kind of think. We're familiar with satire a little bit, but satire isn't only humorous. When you look at historical writings, there's a lot of satire that's not just comical or funny. It can also be very dramatic. And so in this chapter, what we see is a bit of satire, not necessarily literal events, but John writes in this satirical language in order to prove a point. And just a little bit of what we're discussing to kind of point towards the end of our study tonight. For a people who are struggling to determine what is right and what is wrong, for a people who struggle to see where they might be pledging their worship to something other than God, John writes in this satirical language. He writes in this satire language in order to create categories that are easier to comprehend. In order to set up the reader so that they can see, it's obvious when you read this chapter where you want to be. And so he creates these grandiose categories so that the reader can be like, oh yes, I see, that's right and that's not. And so I want to be aligned with that, not that. And he does it, and he proves this, and it's a brilliant chapter. But that just kind of helps us frame the conversation that we're going to have. And so when we go back to verse 1, when we go through this, and I'm gonna kind of move, because this is a big chapter with a lot of content. So we're gonna move through it, and I'm gonna try to get through that, and then we'll discuss what it means. So then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great whore who is seated on many waters. What do you think of when you read what the angel says?" This is vivid language. What do you think of? What is coming to mind here?
Well, I'm thinking of when it says seated on many waters, that she's touched a lot of areas with unfaithfulness and with evil.
Yeah, and that she's touched a lot of people. And when you go to the very end of the chapter, you see that is referenced explicitly. Yeah. So the question, and this is going to be addressed, is who is this whore? And the continuing question for us to ask in our own lives is, this is a question that we need to address. How can we identify her in our own world and in our own lives? Is Babylon still practicing her unfaithful ways in the world? And can we identify her in our own lives? And so that's kind of a fundamental question that John is forcing the readers to ask of themselves. And one thing we recognize that Solveig brought up is that she was seated on many waters. How can she be on many waters?
That means to me she is, like Babylon has conquered many nations.
Yeah.
She has a base, but Babylon is all over because she's conquered so many different countries.
Right. Yeah, and one thing that is interesting is that in Scripture, when you read through the biblical narrative, there are a lot of ancient cities. There were a handful of ancient cities that were called whores. In the Old Testament, Tyre, the city of Tyre, and the city of Nineveh, and then Assyria, they were all considered unfaithful or described in this explicit language. They were called they were prostituting themselves, these ancient cities. And these were all coastal cities or coastal geographical locations. And so we're seeing she's seated upon many waters, these ancient cities. Babylon transcends time and space. Babylon, while having a historical reference point, is referencing a lot more than just historical Babylon.
So doesn't Babylon actually symbolize evil, sinful?
Yeah, Babylon here, it's the unfaithfulness. Yeah, absolutely. So continuing, who is seated on many waters, going into verse 2, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and with the wine of whose fornication the inhabitants of the earth have become drunk. What type of relationship does this woman have with humanity? Inappropriate, right?
Very influential.
But very influential. Right. Kings have slept with her, and the inhabitants of the earth have become drunk with excessive fornication. This is really graphic language. The kings and all of the inhabitants of the earth, they have become intoxicated by sleeping with her. This is graphic language, and we'll discuss in a little bit why this graphic language is here. But right out of the gate, the reader is just kind of confronted with this language. And it causes the reader to kind of take a step back and be like, whoa, I mean, that's explicit, that's graphic. What are we talking about here?
Is that not though has to do with the religion of false gods, accepting and
Yes.
Along with the gods.
Yeah, so part of what we've discussed before and part of what we're seeing tonight is in first century Rome, there would have been many polytheistic practices, those who would have worshipped many gods. And so John is trying to create these categories so that the reader can understand faithfulness to God is singular worship, not worshiping these other false gods. And as we'll see, not worshiping Rome herself as she is begging to be worshipped. So yeah, that's absolutely there, and we'll get into that. And then we move to verse 3. Where is John taken? To the desert, or to the wilderness. He carried me away into a wilderness, into the desert. If you remember back to chapter 12, the woman who was running from the beast finds refuge where? In the desert, in the wilderness. There's a parallel here, only this time, instead of the woman finding refuge in the wilderness, now the woman is hiding in wilderness. And so John is carried away by the Spirit, in the Spirit, into a wilderness. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. Does this sound familiar? Who is the woman sitting on? Who is the woman riding? The beast, which is whom? The Antichrist. This is there's the dragon, the beast, and then the false prophet. This is the beast. This is the one who is supposed to be like Christ. What isn't she riding? Instead of riding a beautiful horse, a stallion, some type of incredible horse, she's riding a monster. What would you expect a queen of swords to ride? Some majestic creature, right? Here, no, it's a monster. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup. What it's full of, we'll discuss in just a minute. But when you read this, when you hear this, what does it sound like? Rich. Purple, scarlet, jewels, pearls, a golden cup. Not just rich, royal. Royal. Rich and royal. She is covered in this royal attire. She's majestic. She is like a queen. You're supposed to hear this and think, oh, this is a queen. And then you hear what is inside her cup. What are the contents of her chalice? It is filled with what? Abominations and impurities of her fornication. As royal as she may be, what is the substance of her riches? How has she achieved this status, this royal status? Through evil, through unfaithfulness, through abominations and impurities. So you read this and you hear of this majestic woman, but then you find out the contents. And it doesn't match. It doesn't fit. And on her forehead was written a name, a mystery. Babylon the Great, mother of horrors and of earth's abominations. One thing that's really interesting is that we are told that we are going to hear her name and that it's written on her forehead. If there's any question about the connection to like a political cartoon or the comic, what often happens when people write a comic, a common practice in satire or in comics, is that they will write the name of a person or a thing on that thing if there's any question about its identity. So when you think of the political cartoons that you've read or that you've seen, oftentimes it will name something so that the reader understands what's going on. So I saw a cartoon that made me laugh. It was a young boy standing on his parents' doorsteps, and the parents are in the doorway saying to a kid looking into the house, when we were your age, we started out with nothing. And the kid is carrying on his back a big sack of money, and it's labeled student debt. And the student said, I would love to start out with nothing. And so the label helps you identify what is there. And she is labeled. What is it? How is she labeled? A mystery. Well, that's interesting. But then we're told what? Her name. Babylon the Great. So we're told that her name is a mystery, right? So you would expect to then have some type of mysterious name given, right? But what then do we hear? I will tell you her name. It's a mystery. Babylon. Ooh. Won't lean on that too much. Why would John tell us it is a mystery and then just plainly say, oh, her name's Babylon? Why would he say, this is a mystery? It's Babylon. Perhaps because Babylon isn't just Babylon. Maybe John is provoking the reader to see that Babylon transcends Babylon. You see, Babylon, and this is appropriate as we've been going through Jeremiah on Sunday mornings, Babylon is the quintessential unfaithful city. It's the quintessential prostituting place. And this is all contingent upon understanding Jeremiah. As we've been going through Jeremiah, in chapter 51, he describes Babylon as Babylon is by mighty waters. And then Jeremiah also describes Babylon as a golden cup in the Lord's hand, making all the earth drunken. Jeremiah 51:7. Jeremiah also says that Babylon eventually falls under divine judgment. Does that sound familiar? A golden cup making all the earth drunk. Does that sound familiar? Sounds like somebody borrowed from Jeremiah here, doesn't it? Yeah, Babylon causes the Judean exile that we read about in Jeremiah and in Lamentations. And so we're hearing that language being used now for the mother of all the unfaithful. This is the one who is most unfaithful and causes other people to become unfaithful.
Back just a bit, when I talk about her fine linen and jewels, isn't that a way of saying that she was something that was very desirable? People, wanted.
Sure.
The whole world wanted this beauty and riches and honor.
Right.
To be part of her is something that is very desirable.
Right.
Until they get to the other part.
Right. And that will become evident as we continue to look through the chapter. Yeah, you think you want to be aligned with Babylon until you see what happens to Babylon. Absolutely. And I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses to Jesus. What is this woman's drink? What does she consume? Of whom? The blood of the faithful, the saints and the witnesses. She hasn't just consumed it. She has engorged herself on it. She's had way too much to drink of it. Not that there's any amount that you should consume of this, but this is, once again, explicit, graphic, over-the-top language. She has become drunk on the blood of the saints and the witnesses. She has imbibed greatly. As you know, I've been referencing a text by Craig Keister, and he has a great thing to say about this passage, about this part here. He writes, "The portrait of the harlot draws on a wealth of stock imagery. In the Old Testament, Israel's relationship to God was compared to a marriage in which God was the husband and Israel was the bride. By worshiping other gods, the people violated their marriage covenant with God and assumed the role of a prostitute who embraced many lovers. The unfaithful one might dress in crimson and deck herself with ornaments of gold, but the prophets warned that all her primping would be in vain, for in the end her lovers would destroy her, which is the fate of Babylon in 17:16, in chapter 17, verse 16. So the language of marriage, a marriage union between God and the covenant people, that is present throughout all of Scripture. So unfaithfulness is equated then with prostituting. And we see that in the prophet Hosea. You see that realized in the prophet Hosea, where Hosea marries a woman who is a prostitute, and then God says, this is my relationship to you guys. You're being unfaithful. Faithfulness is equated with fidelity. So moving on, continuing in verse 6, when I saw her, I was greatly amazed. But the angel said to me, why are you so amazed? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. We'll talk about this further, but what do we make of the 7 heads and 10 horns? Is there anything that you think of? And knowing what's going on later, we'll see this, but Solveig already alluded to this. We may be seeing, at this point, it might be that initial connection to Rome. We'll see in just a little bit. Rome was set on 7 hills. And these 7 heads are likely connected to the 7 hills that we're going to read about later. So then we come to 10 horns. What are these 10 horns? Kings? Yes. I don't know that I have a concrete answer to this. Perhaps there's not an explicit reference, but there have been a lot of bizarre attempts to determine the literal present-day application of the 10 horns. There was a book that was popularized in the 1970s called The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey. And in that book, he describes the 10 horns as being the common European market, and that once there were 10 countries in the common market of Europe, then that was the fulfillment of the apocalypse. Well, there are now more than 10 countries in the European Union. There are quite a few, but what's interesting is that now at least one country has left the European Union. One country has left the common market, the United Kingdom. And so we're seeing that hasn't played out as that was expected, perhaps because this isn't trying to predict specific events, but that was a very America-centric theology, and the United European nations were considered the beast. One thing that Craig Keister writes is that since the common market now has more than 10 member nations, others propose that the United Nations Security Council might be expanded to 10 supreme nations who will rule the world. This thought, and others like it, have to be outright rejected, because this text was written to address the needs of those original hearers and to create within the hearers the sense of, where am I aligned? Where do I fit here? Not to predict specific events that precede Christ's return, if that makes sense. So those type of predictions, like it's the 10 horns with the 7 heads that carry the beast, well, that has to be the European Union, or that has to be some type of United Nations. That just is a bit silly, and we'll discuss a little bit later what those 10 horns might be referencing, but we should see right now that there might not be that one-to-one connection, a literal component to what we see today. The beast that you saw was and is not and is about to ascend from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. This sounds familiar, right? Was and is not and is about to. Sounds similar to the one who was and is to come. Only this time, it's not the one who is, it is the one who is not. It's the opposite of the one who is. What is this? What is this then? This is the anti-Christ. Anti meaning opposite. This is the one who is opposite of Christ. We were told that Christ was and is to come from heaven. There's this descent. Here, this one does what? Comes from where? It was and is not and is about to what? ascend from the bottomless pit. Again, the opposite of Christ. This is one who is trying to mimic Christ. This one is not a real thing. It's merely trying to be like something else. Why would we read that it's like this? Well, we find that out later on in verse 8. How do the inhabitants of the earth respond? What is their response to this? They're amazed, right? The inhabitants of the earth, those who have not been whose names have not been written in the book of life, will be amazed when they see the beast. Even John writes, "When I saw her, I was greatly amazed." What does the language of who was and is not and is about to ascend from the bottomless pit, what does that make? What does that tell us about this beast? It's trying to be like Christ. It's a faux Christ. And it creates this sense of awe and amazement within people so that they will follow it rather than whom? Christ. Absolutely. It will deceive. And do you know in Hebrew what ha-satan means? That's Hebrew for the Satan. Every time Satan is written in the Old Testament, it's given with a definite article, the Satan. Do you know what Satan means in Hebrew? Deceiver. This is the deceiver. And this is the one who has been given authority by the deceiver. The Antichrist being was given authority by the dragon to speak on its behalf. So here we have exactly right, Martin, the one who is deceiving the inhabitants of the earth. Why are they amazed at this?
His seemingly power, authority, majesty.
Absolutely. Keister writes again, many of the inhabitants of the earth, including some Christians, if you go back to chapter 3, verse 17, became intoxicated with the prosperity that Rome provided and were willing to commit fornication with the cult of the emperor. In the most basic sense, however, fornication means not only participation in the idolatrous worship of Roman gods, including Caesar, but accepting Rome as the point of orientation for life in this world that is making Rome herself a god. And we'll continue to see this as we move on from 9. It really starts to come alive. But here's a question. This is an important word, and we have to ask ourselves, I like that language, this point of orientation. Rome became the point of orientation for these people and therefore made Rome their god. So we have to ask ourselves at this point in this chapter, are there any things that we have made a point of orientation in our lives? And if so, have we considered those points of orientations to be divine, to be deities, to be these gods in our lives? Because for the Christian, what is the point of orientation? Christ. The resurrection. What is our point of orientation? It's the resurrection. It's Christ. That is the center from which all else comes. So what other points of orientation do we have in our lives? What things in our lives do we say, well, this is the sole identity, and therefore everything else is referenced to that? What's the point of orientation? And we don't need to have a big conversation about that now, but that's something that John is really forcing the readers to question. This is forcing the readers to say, am I amazed at the beast, or am I amazed at the Christ? Have I turned these other things into, have I turned these anti-things into the thing? So let's keep going. It's 6:40. We've got 20 minutes, and we're halfway through, almost. Yes.
If the beast was the Antichrist, why was he trying to be like Christ?
To deceive. To deceive. Why was the beast like Christ? Why was it an antichrist? because Christ is the truth, because Christ is the way. And so in order to deceive the inhabitants of the earth, it looks like it has all authority. But all authority is not all authority is not attributed to the beast. It's attributed to whom? Christ. And so to try to deceive people, it has to have this false, the false narrative or the false image of authority. But it doesn't, because that is given to Christ, who we'll see is Lord of Lords and King of Kings.
The scripture says that people try to deceive even the elect.
He will just try to deceive even the elect. Yes. So let's keep moving. Verse 9, this calls for a mind that has wisdom. Okay, we got to pause again. This calls for a mind that has wisdom. This is a signal. When you read this, what do you think?
We better take a good look.
This calls for a mind that has wisdom. Pay attention to what I'm about to write. Interpret these words. He's saying this isn't a secret code. Anyone who knew anything could have understood what he was about to say. And what does he say? The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. Now, so often there are these end times predictions that try to decode Revelation. Have you ever heard of people who are going to decode Revelation? As if Revelation was written in the secret code. But for the original hearers, the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. This is not secret language. Because Rome was called by Rome herself a city on 7 hills. I mean, everyone knew that. There was no, I'm trying to think of a common correlation that we would have in the United States. Something that, it would be like one nation under God. Obviously, we're talking about the United States of America. That's something that Americans know about America. To say, seated on 7 mountains. Oh, Rome, duh. I mean, it's not a question. There's no code here. It's just plain language. But he's saying but use wisdom, because you have to interpret what this means for your life. And also, they are 7 kings, of whom 5 have fallen. 1 is living, and the other has not yet come. So the 7 mountains are 7 kings. What do we make of these 7 kings? Are these 7 literal kings? What does 7 mean? Completion, perfection. I don't think it's appropriate for us to say that these are 7 literal kings, because we have no way to determine which 7 kings are being referenced. I mean, there were more than 7 kings in the history of Rome. We're obviously talking about Rome at this point, but who are the 7 kings? Who are we? Do we pick Caesar, the first king? Do we pick Domitian and Nero, the most cruel kings? I mean, how do you narrow that field down? Perhaps John is using evocative imagery that resists decoding. 7 means complete. So perhaps what we are reading about is the completeness of empire against the kingdom of God. Perhaps what we're reading about is the totality of the beast's power. Because no enumeration of Roman emperors fully suits Revelation chapter 17, despite many creative attempts in this direction. Then it says, of whom 5 have fallen, 1 is living and the other has not yet to come. And when he comes, he must remain for only a little while. As for the beast that was and is not, it is an 8th, but it belongs to the 7. What do we do with that? So it has 7 heads, and then the beast is an 8th king, but it belongs to the 7, and it goes to destruction. Keister notes that this likely plays on the myth of Nero. You remember the myth of Nero we discussed in the past? Nero died, but then there was this myth that maybe Nero hadn't really died, like Elvis, right? I mean, there's the myth of Elvis. Elvis never died, right? He's coming back. Elvis is coming back, right? There were Nero impersonators in Rome. There were people that would dress up like Nero and would go around Rome and say, I'm Nero, I have returned. so that it's playing on the myth of Nero, that Nero was going to return, so that one could say of a future persecution of the people of God, it's Nero all over again. So that's kind of what we're seeing. This is Nero all over again. But what happens to the beast? In verse 11 there, it goes to destruction. So regardless of the particular symbolism of this beast, what do we know about it? It will be destroyed. This beast goes to destruction. The beast can't help but go to destruction. Yeah, we see this is judgment, but who is the agent doing the acting here? The beast goes to destruction. This is self-destruction. The beast can't help but self-destruct. This is what evil does. Evil eventually self-destructs. And remember, that's how we've described the wrath of God throughout the study. It's God letting people live into the reality for which they choose. When you choose to live contrary to God, there's self-destruction. So, in the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour together with the beast. Now, which 10 kings throughout history do you choose for these? Your guess is as good as mine. These are united in yielding their power and authority to the beast. They will make war on the earth, make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those with him are called and chosen and faithful. The completeness of those against Christ and his kingdom will attempt to wage war against it. But before we ever hear of any war, what happens? They will fail. We're going to read a little bit about a war in chapter 19. But here, before we even get to that, what do we know about those who are united against the kingdom of God? What will happen to them? They will be conquered. These kingdoms of the earth that demand to be worshipped are all united in their worshiping of the beast, and they fight the kingdom. But what happens? The Lamb conquers them. Why? Because he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And remember back in Revelation, how does the Lamb conquer? Do you remember how the Lamb conquers? Do you remember the way that the Lamb conquers? By being slain. And this is the upside-down kingdom. The Lamb conquers in this war that is being waged against him by dying and being raised to life, by being slain. It's the upside-down kingdom. It doesn't make sense. But the Lamb is Lord of lords and King of kings, and no matter what, these powers and authorities that are aligned with the beast, no matter what they do, they're going to lose. They're going to lose. And he said to me, the waters that you saw where the whore is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. So, we discussed before, what are the waters? Well, here we see that Babylon, that this harlot, is not limited to just a literal Babylon, or as we've seen tonight, a literal Rome. It's seated, the waters that it is seated on are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. We're told that the whore sits on many waters. And perhaps this is a reference to Rome, because Rome it conquered almost all of the known world at the time. But perhaps it's not limited just to Rome even there. Perhaps the waters that you saw are peoples over all of the earth. Maybe the harlot is empire wherever empire is found. Empire, and when we talk about empire, it's that agent that demands to be worshipped in place of God. Wherever that's present in the world, we are seeing the harlot, those who demand to be worshipped instead of God. And the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the whore. Well, hold on a second. I thought the whore was riding on the beast. Right? I mean, that's what we read about, right? The harlot was on top of the beast. But what happens to the harlot? She's hated by the beast. This is evidently a house divided. We see that even the beast she rides turns on her. If Babylon, if this harlot represents unfaithfulness, this infidelity to God, what we see is that pledging one's worship to the beast eventually turns in on itself. By worshiping the beast, you might get the image of royalty, right? There's these riches, this beauty, but what happens is that it leads to self-destruction. It turns in on itself. She's given herself to the beast, but what does the beast do to her? It turns on her. It leaves her naked and desolate. This is what happens with evil. When you give yourself to these evil ways, what happens is destruction. Evil never helps you out. And when you give yourself to the beast, all it does is lead to nakedness and desolation. They will make her desolate and naked. They will devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. We discussed earlier how with the kings of the earth, one who is coming back is kind of like, it's Nero all over again. Well, this is an ironic turn of events right here. Because under Nero, there was a fire, and he blamed it on the Christians, and crucified and executed Christians all over Rome because of that. Well, what happens to Babylon? This is poetic justice of sorts. It is Nero all over again, only this time the harlot is burned. And do you remember what Nero did to Christians at a party that he was hosting? Christians were the torches for his party, to light the party. So this is a bit of poetic justice that Babylon is burned with fire, not the saints. For God put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose. Now, this can be a bit challenging, because here it almost sounds like the beast is an agent of God. Perhaps when you go back through the Old Testament, the role of the deceiver is not so cut and dry. When you read Job, the deceiver is almost an agent of the divine counsel. God permits the deceiver to do what the deceiver does. And so this can be a hard thing for us to grapple, but what I think is important here, lest we think that the beast has this ultimate authority and power, we see that the beast is still subject to God. We see that as much as the beast tries to say it is all-powerful, what do we see? It's not. It's not. And so I'm not wanting to make a case tonight that the deceiver is in some way God's minion. But I think what this is telling us is that the deceiver doesn't have all the authority that the deceiver thinks it has. The beast doesn't have the power that the beast thinks it has.
Is this part of the deceived beginning to understand that it has been deceived?
Perhaps.
And turn against the destroyer.
Right.
In other words, destroy itself.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So God put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose. I mean, this is what happens when you choose to live contrary to God. If you choose to live contrary to God, then what's put in your heart is self-destruction. by agreeing to give their kingdom of the beast until the words of God will be fulfilled. So what do these kingdoms do? What does Babylon do? And what we see in verse 17 is incredibly important. What does Babylon do? Agrees to give their kingdom to the beast. This is what happens until the words of God will be fulfilled. And then in verse 18, the woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. Okay, if there are any people listening that have not understood what we're talking about yet, here, there's an explicit reference. John is saying, listen, if you haven't picked it up by now, let me just say it plainly. What is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth? What is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth? For first century, it's Rome. And Babylon is Rome. If there's any question about who we're discussing, you Roman Christians, you Christians living in Asia Minor under Roman rule, Babylon is Rome. Because Rome is empire, and Rome demands to be worshipped. Rome demands to be the place of orientation. So, the message is that Christians may find themselves in difficult straits. With the woman who flees to the wilderness outside the social mainstream, Christians might find themselves there. But if the other option is to cozy up, this is Keister writing, with a debauched prostitute and her pet beast, readers might find that life outside the social mainstream is not so bad. So it seems like here are the options. You can be chased by the beast with the woman who flees into the wilderness and be a social outcast. Or you could perhaps not be a social outcast and cozy up to the harlot and the beast. Which sounds better to you? See, the portrayal of the harlot is designed to unmask the seductive powers, the deceiving powers that dull the reader's perceptions, startling them with a keener awareness of what faith means. This is satire. This is caricature. It accentuates certain things to prove a point. So the question for us tonight, church, in the last 2 minutes, so we're going to discuss it deeply. Or maybe it's a question that we're left with. Are there any seductive powers that dull our perceptions? The question we asked earlier, are there any points of orientation in our life that demand to be the center? You are this, and so everything else is referenced to this. Everything else is subject to this. Are there any points of orientation that demand to give us our identity and our being? Are there any ways that we have given ourselves, maybe not personally, maybe this is socially or culturally, are there any ways that we give ourselves over to something other than the kingdom of God? If we do, then we're aligning ourselves with the beast. That's what John is saying. There's no both and here, right? He's dividing here. You cannot have both the mark of the beast and the mark of the lamb, right? He's saying, which mark are you going to bear? What will be your point of orientation? The beast, Babylon, whatever Babylon might be, or will your point of orientation be the cross of Christ? You cannot serve both God and mammon, as we read just a few weeks ago on Sunday morning. Absolutely. You belong to one or the other. So what is your point of orientation? What is the center by which everything else is relative? If it's not the cross of Christ, if it's not Christ and his kingdom, then we've really got to do some searching, according to John. We've really got to ask ourselves, am I worshiping Christ or am I worshiping one who looks like Christ? Have I been deceived? So yeah, Kayla, I think your word earlier was right. This is kind of heavy. Kind of heavy, but it's important and it's good. Any final thoughts or any final questions? It's 7 o'clock and I want to respect the time that we have allotted, but if there's one final thought or question, yes, Retha.
Okay, I'm still thinking about Babylon the Great.